In the spirit of my dog ate the homework, a few years ago, researchers gathered together some excuses that parents sent to their schools for their children to excuse them or to explain situations about their participation in school. And supposedly these were collected from the Albuquerque public school system. Probably not unique to them, however. Dear school, please excuse John from being absent January 28th, 29th, 30th, 31st, 32nd, and 33. My son is under the doctor's care and should not take physical ed. Please execute him. Please excuse Joyce from PE for a few days. Yesterday she fell off of a tree and misplaced her hip. Ralph was absent yesterday because he had a sore trout. Mrs. Smith, please excuse Tommy for being absent yesterday. He had diarrhea and his boots leak. Please excuse Sarah from being absent. She was sick and I had her shot. Jennifer missed school yesterday for a good reason. We forgot to get the Sunday paper off the porch, and when we found it Monday, we thought it was Sunday. When I think back of some of the excuses that I've used in various situations, I find it difficult to derive much joy from someone else's misery, because making excuses is not something that's unique to us. As I pointed out on the front page of our bulletin this week, really the art of making excuses for our shortcomings can be traced all the way back to the Garden of Eden. After all, Adam and Eve were given one restriction, and that one restriction was not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. However, they both succumbed to that temptation. And so when confronted, Adam blamed Eve, and Eve blamed the serpent. Well, actually, if we're going to be completely accurate, Adam blamed God because he says, "You're the one that gave me this woman." And so the idea of making excuses is something that has a rich and old tradition. And in this parable that Jimmy read for us this morning, we see Jesus tackling this idea of making excuses. When I remember back on the research that I did preparing for our New Year's sermon, if the statistics hold true, then about 60% of those of us who made New Year's resolutions are still keeping them. 40% has broken them. Every time that we break a New Year's resolution, it's always accompanied by an excuse. I wanted to keep this resolution, but something interfered, something got in the way. In this parable that Jesus tells, the leading up to the parable in verse 15, Luke says that when one of those who sat at the table with Jesus heard what he was saying, he said to him, "Blessed is he who shall eat bread in the kingdom of God." Now, the Jewish people were living in the state of expectation for God to send a Messiah, someone who would deliver them from the Romans and someone who would restore, in their expectations, the Davidic kingdom of the Old Testament. And so they were anticipating this Messiah, never stopping to consider that the one who was in their presence was this Messiah. This participant of the feast reflects upon how blessed it would be to be able to eat bread in the kingdom of heaven. And so that prompted the parable that we want to look at this morning. Then Jesus said to him in verse 16, "A certain man gave a great supper, and he invited many. And he sent his servants at supper time to say to those who were invited, 'Come, all things are ready. Come to the feast.' Then Jesus said, 'But they all with one accord began to make excuses. And the first one said to him, I have bought a piece of ground, and I must go and see it. I ask you to have me excused.'" In this statement, this individual is reflecting upon his possessions. And so in the face of this invitation to this great feast, this person's response was to ask to be excused because of his possessions. When we think about eating a meal, and we can see this is true in our own lives, and we enact it out, we embody it on the second Sunday of each month as we gather together for a fellowship meal. But we know that that activity has a deeper significance than just socializing or just feeding our bodies. But it's a time for a deeper reflection, a deeper fellowship to one another. It's an opportunity to bind ourselves together even tighter as a family. But this individual, his first thought was his fields. He said, "I bought a piece of ground and I must go and see it. I ask you to have me to be excused." Within the Jewish mindset and within the Christian mindset as well, the idea of feasting often carries with it implications of God working out his ultimate plan. So in, for example, Revelation chapter 19, as John is describing the second coming of Jesus, the judgment of the world, and preparing ourselves to enter into an eternal destiny, whether that be heaven or hell, John pictures that scene, he encapsulates that scene in the idea of a feast. So Revelation 19 and verse 7, we have the positive side of the coin, where John writes, "Let us be glad and rejoice and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come. His wife has made herself ready. And to her it was granted to be arrayed in fine linen, clean and bright, for the linen is the righteous acts of the saints." And then he said to me, "Write, blessed are those who are called to the marriage supper of the Lamb." And he said to me, "These things are true sayings of God." So we see the righteous, the saved, on this occasion, and they are given the great honor of being invited to a feast. It's a marriage feast, the marriage between Jesus and the church. Picking up on the idea that Paul has in Ephesians of the church being the bride of Christ. But there's another feast that's described in this chapter. If you look down to verse 20, John describes the other side of the coin, the people who were not invited to the marriage feast of the Lamb. In verse 20, John describes, "Then the beast was captured, and with him the false prophets who worked signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who received the mark of the beast, and those who worshipped his image. These two were cast alive into the lake of fire, burning with brimstone, and the rest were killed with the sword which proceeded from his mouth, from the mouth of him who sat on the horse, and the birds were filled with their flesh. So there are two feasts that take place here describing at the end of time. On the one hand, it's the marriage feast of the Lamb. On the other hand, it's the buzzards feasting on the condemned. It's a horrible picture, but if you focus on the one, the marriage supper of the Lamb, then our mind is probably close to being in the place of this objector in Luke chapter 14. And then we realize that we need to have a reorientation of our priorities. To ask ourselves, what's really important in my life? Jesus responds to that in Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21, in a passage that's very familiar to you, when he said, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And so here is this man in Luke chapter 14, and he's eating in the presence of Jesus, and he makes this exclamation, "Blessed are those who are invited to this heavenly feast of the Messiah." And Jesus responds by telling this parable and focusing first on this man, whose focus is on his possessions. I clipped something a number of years ago from the newspaper. This actually came from October 9th, 1987. I don't even know if Dear Abby is still around. But I'd like to read you this reply that was made to something that Dear Abby had said in a previous column. The writer says, "Dear Abby, in regard to the lady who was depressed because she lost her precious picture albums, letters, and family treasures in a flood. I know just how she feels, and I sympathize with her. Our home was burned to the ground in December. We lost everything we had. We thought the bottom had fallen out of our world. And then a few days later, my husband's sisters, 3 children, drowned. After Christmas, we sent our children back to school without books. They sent their books back to school without children. We could no longer feel sorry for ourselves." Ruth Calcutt, Sanford, North Carolina. As we think about what we have, I think it's important for us to reflect upon the one who has so richly blessed us in this life, and to realize that the physical things that we surround our lives with, that we fill our lives with, are only temporary, and in the long scheme of things have little value. Sadly, sometimes it takes something shocking to remind us of what's really important in life. Jesus, I think, does that in this parable. In verse 18, another one said, "I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I am going to test them. I ask you to have me excused." This individual was willing to miss out on a great feast because of obligations that he had for 5 yoke of oxen to test them, to prove them in the field, rather than to come to this great and noble feast. I realize that we live in a world that constantly makes demands on our time. It's easy for us to fill up our appointment books with those demands. And it's easy to busy ourselves with the activity of living and making a living. But how sad it is when those temporary obligations creep in and obscure from our vision what's really important to us. To miss out on a great feast because of the obligations of the world. There will be a time when time will be no more. There'll be no more appointments to schedule, no more deadlines, no more pressures. When that time comes, will I be ready, prepared to embrace that which is eternal? It is a difficult balance, I admit, to balance the obligations and the demands of life with the opportunities of being with God's people. But the rewards of the sacrifice will be worth it. I must be careful to not allow the obligations of this life to keep me from what is really important. To daily spend time with God in His Word, constantly be connected with Him in prayer, to appreciate the opportunities of being with God's people and the opportunities to grow that are associated with it. But this man was willing to throw that away because of the obligations of time. And in verse 20, another man said, I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come. Well, on the face of things, I think this man's got more of a case. Well, at least he has more of a standing as far as the scriptures are concerned, because in Deuteronomy chapter 24 and verse 5, we learned that a Jewish man who is recently married can be excused from military service. However, here's the problem. What Jesus is talking about in this parable is not war, but it's life. And so this man becomes a challenge. It's important for us to cultivate and grow relationships in this life. And we treasure and value those relationships, whether they be with one another as brothers and sisters in Christ. Perhaps it's with those of the world that we hope to cultivate and to eventually be able to share our faith in Jesus with. It's important for us to have relationships, but we have to be careful to not allow the relationships that we have in life to keep us from the feast to which we are invited as Christians. In fact, as I look at this man, a relationship that not only keeps us from the feast, but eventually gets us so we don't even desire to attend the feast. Because this is the trick with our relationships. Our relationships that we hold on to can pull us closer to the Lord or pull us down back into the world. And so while we need to have all of these relationships, we have to keep our relationships in proper perspective. reminding ourselves what's really important in this world. In 1953, Queen Elizabeth II was about to be crowned. And official invitations were sent out to special people that were invited to this coronation service. And all the information was included about where to be, the time, the date, the location, everything that was going on. And then at the bottom of the invitation were these words emblazoned across the bottom: all excuses ceasing. When I think about the invitation that my Lord has made for me, your Lord has made for you, recorded for us by Matthew in chapter 11, verse 28 through 30. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, for I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So when I reflect back upon this invitation and this parable, I think about the possessions, the obligations, and the relationships of this life. I have to be careful in drawing up the priorities by which I live to not allow these things to interfere with myself being able to fully appreciate and enjoy the Lord's invitation that's extended to me. To not allow my possessions, the demands on my time, the relationship, to keep me from serving God in the way that Jesus calls me to do. But then I don't really understand that. Because shouldn't my possessions and my obligations and my relationships cause me to appreciate my Lord even more because of the way that He's blessed my life? So this morning, I hope that you can reflect upon your life and think about the possessions, the obligations, and the relationships that you have. Have they come between you and serving God? If that is the case in your life, then we want to encourage you this morning to re-examine your priorities in Jesus. If you're outside of Jesus, we want to encourage you to think about the blessings that await you by coming to Jesus. He will enrich you, maybe not physically, maybe not in physical wealth, but rich, rich blessings await you in Jesus. This morning, as you look at your life, if you have a need that we can help you with that will help to draw you closer to Jesus, to reaffirm your priorities in life, to help you to make sure that when this world comes to an end, that you are ready for the world that is awaiting us, and that we can enter and enjoy the eternity with God together forever. Whatever your need might be this morning, bring Christ those burdens and receive the blessings that await you. Please come as we stand and sing the song that Jan selected.